Resume our meeting, and I'd like to welcome our witnesses on this the second panel. We have with us Professor Marie-Christine Dorin, full professor, School of Political Studies, University of Ottawa. We have from the Canadian Nuclear Association, George Christidis, President and Chief Executive Officer, and online we have Brian Moon, President of Hydrogen Canada Corp, and his colleague, Brendan O'Connell, Vice President, Business Development. So all witnesses have conducted a mandatory witness onboarding test, those that are on the screen, and I'll just make a few comments for the benefits of our witnesses, particularly our new ones. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. A reminder that all comments should be made through the chair, and you will each have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will open the floor to questions. Professor Dorin, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Donc, honorable membre du comité.
Thank you, honorable members of the committee. Thank you for this invitation. I just gave a course to Global Affairs Canada on trade for Canada, especially in Latin America, where I'm a specialist in. As a whole, Canada is going through an unprecedented period and when it comes to our natural resources, our know-how when it comes to green energy and the energy transition. These opportunities are concentrated in certain countries. Fortunately, we have reliable, long-lasting partners that are very committed to international law, multilateralism, and upholding the rule of law. But in stark contrast, however, we are also seeing several other countries, notably close allies of the Trump administration, that are engaging in a voluntary weakening of the legal framework that normally guarantees predictable and stable trade relations. And the international indices in these countries, in fact, their corruption indices are also up, as well as violence linked to drug trafficking and repeated states of exception. So in detail, what this means for us, let's start with the opportunities, unprecedented opportunities for Canada. Countries that remain reliable partners, medium powers, middle powers engaged in multilateralism and fair, reliable trade agreements. Well, these countries are Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and Uruguay. Since 2025, we're seeing an unprecedented strengthening of our bilateral trade with Mexico with the implementation of the Canada-Mexico Plan 2020-2028 based on resources put forward by both of our governments. And this was confirmed by the ambassadors of Canada and Mexico and of Mexico in Canada. And this is part of the course I gave to GAC. Now, Mexico is a key market for Canadian exporters, especially for those in agriculture, clean energy, but not oil, mostly green energy, mining, automobiles, and aerospace. And so it is. Mexico has gone from being the 15th to the 12th largest economy in the world, and it is a solid democracy with respect for checks and balances, First Nations, and human rights, and multilateralism. It's also important to highlight the new opportunities for Canada because we have been invited to integrate new trade agreements, multilateral ones, including Mercosur and the Pacific Alliance. So if we accept these invitations, that would allow us to meet the objectives of our 5 partner countries who are actively promoting these platforms. And in that sense, Canada's support would go towards countries that uphold the rule of law. And these are crucial agreements for reinforcing our connections with Brazil, Mexico, and other countries. These are all countries who hold these values and appreciate them in Canada. Of course, we also need to mention that Mexico, Brazil have also, with another country, have formed an agreement based on multilateralism in trade, faced with the Trump threats. So we're also seeing new alliances that are being formed, and Canada could take its place there. Now, if we look at the risks, in stark contrast, several countries are no longer reliable partners for Canada, and they're putting our exports and investments at risk, notably El Salvador, Ecuador, Honduras, Bolivia, Argentina, perhaps also Chile and Costa Rica, several of these countries with whom we have free trade agreements. Currently, these countries are engaged in the weakening or destruction of the rule of law and the regulatory frameworks that are necessary for reliable trade. For example, the new Bolivian president, Rodrigo Paz, has recently eliminated the Ministry of Justice and decreed that all its responsibilities would fall under the Ministry of the Presidency itself, raising major risks of corruption and mismanagement, and of course for our trade. There's also the risk of an increase of violence in these countries, which is quite paradoxical. For example, the President Bukele in El Salvador, who accuses the rule of law and democracy of protecting criminals, has seen violence increase in Ecuador, which is the most violent country in the Americas since 2023 and since the implementation of these methods. And of course, according to the Global Crime Index 2025, the Bukele government is also involved at high levels in 2 new cartels, despite its false new good reputation, and Mr. Trump calls them America's coolest dictator. So all of these countries are being governed by the extreme far right, and they're also part of the ideological alliance under U.S. leadership, the Coalition Shields of the Americas. The role of the United States since the proclamation of the Dunro Doctrine, which led to the military intervention in Venezuela, also has a major negative impact on Canada's trade relations, because you'll recall that the Dunro Doctrine allows the United States to obtain strategic natural resources needed for its hegemonic role in the Americas and to exert control over internal politics. It's quite incredible. And there were joint military operations in March by the U.S. They were unprecedented with Ecuador and an agreement signed with Honduras demonstrating a military desire on the part of the U.S. to take over the natural resources. So you can see that this is quite worrisome, but we have to be aware of this.
Yes,
Professor.
this is my last paragraph.
Thank you.
Le Mexique.
Mexico and our 4 other reliable partners are strongly fighting for security while upholding the rule of law. And these are places that are more appealing for our natural resource exports. So I recommend that Canada concentrate its exports of natural resource towards these partners, Mexico, Brazil especially, and that it join world alliances. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Professor Doran, and we'll go on to Mr. Christidis for 5 minutes.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good morning to all of you, members of the committee. It's a privilege to appear before you today on behalf of the Canadian Nuclear Association. For over 60 years, the CNA has been the voice of Canada's nuclear industry. Today, we represent over 200 members from coast to coast, from world-leading utilities, multinational mining companies, small suppliers, innovative startups. Together, we form one of the most advanced nuclear ecosystems in the world. It is critically important that nuclear sector is part of any discussion in terms of Canada's future, because this sector is foundational and strategic national asset. Nuclear energy plays an important role not only in our energy system, but also in our economic competitiveness, long-term energy security, and environmental objectives. This strength is built on what we have here at home. Canada has vast uranium resources, a full end-to-end supply chain, proven reactor technologies, strong research and development capabilities, and global leadership in nuclear medicine. We are already demonstrating that strength through successful refurbishments at Bruce, at Darlington, the next phase at Pickering nuclear power stations, and the construction of the first small reactors in the G7 at Darlington are all foundational to our success. Canada is showing leadership at a time when interest in nuclear energy is growing globally. This is beginning to be driven by the need for reliable, clean power, increasing electrification, and renewed focus on energy security. We are seeing strong interest from countries around the world that are looking to partner with Canada on nuclear energy development. This represents a significant opportunity for Canadian companies and for the broader economy. To realize this opportunity, a coordinated strategic approach will be important, and continued federal leadership will be essential in supporting Canadian nuclear exports. What is needed is a more integrated long-term approach that connects domestic development with international opportunities. In the nuclear sector, government-to-government relationships are essential to enabling market access and building long-term partnerships. This includes identifying priority markets and aligning efforts across government and industry, while also taking a long-term approach to market development that supports both immediate export opportunities and the development of new markets over time. It also requires a coordinated approach that brings together government, industry, regulators, academic institutions to support both commercial opportunities and long-term partnerships. We also want to recognize the important work done already by the Export Development Corporation and other institutions that support clean energy in major projects. These efforts are important. As Canada looks to expand nuclear exports, and strategic financial support will be important. This includes aligning financial institutions with a broad economic trade approach to international engagement. Clear, predictable, and competitive financing frameworks will help ensure Canadian companies can compete effectively in global markets. Finally, success internationally is closely linked to our success at home. Continue to invest and advance domestic projects supporting investment through tools as the investment tax credit, improving regulatory efficiency, investing in workforce development, all will be important. These efforts help to demonstrate Canada's capabilities and strengthen our position as a reliable partner internationally. In closing, Canada has a strong foundation to build on. With continued collaboration between government and industry, there's an opportunity to further strengthen Canada's role in the global nuclear sector. The Canadian Nuclear Association is actively working with industry and with governments to help identify priority markets and support Canadian engagement internationally. We will be pleased to provide additional information to this committee. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Christidis. We're on now to Mr. O'Connell. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Brendan O'Connell. I'm the Vice President of Business Development at Hydrogen Canada Corp, an Alberta corporation. With us today is also Brian Moon. He's the president of our company. Hydrogen Canada is looking to build a $3.5 billion world-class blue ammonia hydrogen/ammonia facility in Western Canada for export to Asia. The company will take advantage of cost-effective natural gas in Canada and the relatively short, safe supply routes to Asia to provide a secure supply of clean energy to Korea and other Asian countries. Each facility will represent up to $800 million in incremental GDP for Canada and create more than 100,000 direct, indirect, and induced man-years of employment in Canada. And the Asian market can supply multiple facilities. Since 2022, Hydrogen Canada raised $10 million, bought land in the Alberta heartland, and completed its preliminary engineering work. Hydrogen Canada's facility was going to use natural gas to produce low-carbon blue hydrogen and then convert it to liquid ammonia. It would capture more than 96% of its CO2 and sequester it in one of the commercial CCS hubs in Western Canada. The liquid ammonia would be shipped to international markets in Asia via Trigon's Gateway Export Facility in Prince Rupert, which is partially owned by local Aboriginals. Hydrogen Canada targeted the Korean market due to its commitment to using hydrogen/ammonia to decarbonize its power sector, the size of that mandated market, and the fact that Hydrogen Canada has strong relationships in Korea. The government of Korea has passed legislation requiring the blending of hydrogen and ammonia in its power sector in order to reduce emissions. It has also committed to net zero by 2050. Korea still has approximately 35 gigawatts of coal-fired power, and co-firing ammonia in those plants can significantly reduce their emissions. It is also committed to net zero. Korea imports over 84% of its energy every day. So this is as much about clean energy as it is about gigajoules of energy. The legislated demand for hydrogen and ammonia in Korea could reach 16 million tons per annum by 2036. Power companies were looking to sign contracts last year. Hydrogen Canada is in a unique position to supply low-carbon energy to Asia, due in part to the low carbon intensity of Canada's differentiated natural gas. In combination with the company's plant design, Hydrogen Canada can produce hydrogen with the lowest carbon intensity of any facility globally. Hydrogen Canada submitted its process information to a Korean agency 2 years ago, and that agency issued a preliminary carbon intensity rating of less than 1 kilogram of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen, one of the lowest ratings globally. Hydrogen Canada spent the last 3 years developing its project. The company worked with Natural Resources Canada to develop an export strategy for an Alberta-based facility. Hydrogen Canada was recently informed that Enercan had deferred plans to support a rail-based export strategy. In January, Hydrogen Canada hosted a major Korean conglomerate looking for energy opportunities in Canada. This company still sees significant market for clean ammonia developing in South Korea, Japan, and Asia more broadly. And it is still very interested in supporting the development of facilities in Canada. Hydrogen Canada has since refocused its efforts on a facility based on Canada's west coast. Hydrogen Canada believes there is still a significant opportunity for Canada to become a global leader in clean energy supplied to Asia. However, Canada needs to respond in the very near term, or the investment will go elsewhere. We need to align federal and provincial policy and ensure that the industry can move forward as soon as possible. The recent events in the Middle East highlight the need for democratic, energy-producing countries like Canada to provide secure, clean energy to its global partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Connell. Thank you to all of our witnesses. We're now going to start our round of questions. We are going to start with Mr. Tucker for 6 minutes. Mr. Tucker.
Yes, and thank you to our witnesses and for our committee members for being here today. In terms of regulation of the nuclear industry in Canada and the idea of cutting red tape and making regulatory progress on speeding things up, are we on track right now?
Thank you very much for the question. And, you know, this is where the opportunity is. We feel, the Canadian Nuclear Association, that the domestic regulatory environment isn't necessarily reflecting the importance of making sure that the regulatory regime is effective and efficient enough to accelerate the development and deployment of nuclear technologies across this country. So, for example, we're seeing an increase in number of regulatory docs at the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, which is, yes, a world Tier 1 regulator in the world, highly respected, obviously from an industry perspective, knowledgeable. But the trend line, and when we take a look at the regulatory environment in Canada, doesn't match up to the international trend. You're seeing key countries like the United States, United Kingdom, France, Finland, and other spaces that are accelerating or reviewing their regulatory requirements to reduce duplication, increase efficiency, and certainly when it comes to spaces that have nothing to do with safety. So I'd argue that there is an opportunity here as the government is looking at how to strengthen the domestic economy, the domestic energy system, and create opportunities internationally. The domestic regulatory regime is really important to look at.
And talking just a little historically, you said the last 10 years we've gone in the wrong direction. I understand the one number is is this true? There's 80% more regulation now than 10 years ago? In the one briefing that CNA identified that number.
Yeah, if you take a look at the regulatory requirements under the CNSC, we've seen a trend over the last 10 years that's actually increased about 80%. And again, those are the type of examples by which I think the industry would like.
But that doesn't match up. If we're supposed to move at speeds we've never seen before in Canada, how can that possibly be the government, the Liberal government, has added 80% on this important industry?
Well, we feel that is the opportunity where you could take a look at the regulatory requirements, reducing duplications that are not related to safety needs, just to stress that. And then again, just to reaffirm that the important role that this Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission does play, but we feel the regulatory requirements need to trend another direction, and there's an opportunity to improve it.
And maybe for a real world example for our community to understand how this has hurt us, Denison Mines in Saskatchewan just got approved. But could you unpack a little bit about the timelines that project faced and how that might highlight why we need these changes so much.
Mr. Chair, I could follow up with more specifics in terms of that particular project, but I'll just reiterate the fact that the regulatory environment is such that timelines and meeting timelines is an issue, right? And not only for our own industry, for a number of industries, but it has been our experience overall that there does need to be an increased lens on where you could reduce duplications, increase regulatory efficiency, where you do not hinder anything to do with safety. And so I'll defer to that.
I would welcome you to put in a submission in a written brief on how that project was stalled and the net results for our Canadian economy. You spoke about the importance of the value of Canadian natural resources such as uranium, and it's a crucial element of our strategy for, well, the free world strategy for energy security from hostile foreign powers. How does uranium fit into our position with allies around the world?
So our sector, which includes, of course, Saskatchewan-based uranium, which is some of the best deposits in the world, has been critical in the geopolitical realignment, where there's been an effort to replace, uranium from other sources, non-allied sources, and so we've seen a significant increase in markets for companies such as Cameco, for example, is based in Saskatchewan, in places like Eastern Europe, in Asia, and in the United States, where there's an increased need for uranium. And therefore, there's a wonderful opportunity there for Canadian exports. You saw the recent Prime Minister and the government engage in India, for example. That was a very positive, development in terms of the potential for uranium exports. Along with uranium exports is, of course, the whole Canadian supply chain, which currently the Canadian supply chain is really predominantly can-do based. And there's just a wonderful opportunity that's associated with the export as a number of different countries, for their own geopolitical, environment, and energy security needs, are looking at nuclear technologies, both large and small. And Canada's really playing a leadership role. So we're seeing a lot of interest, again, in Eastern Europe, whether it's Poland, where Minister Hodgson had just recently gone, Romania, and in Asia, where large and small reactors.
On the European countries you named, and they're all the ones that are NATO allies, has the CNA presented the Liberal government the idea that some of those costs for the nuclear industry and what we provide to our allies should be included in our 2% NATO spend?
Yeah, just a quick response, please.
Yeah, that is a concept that's emerged. I must admit, I'm not an expert in the definition of NATO contributions, but I do know a number of key members have made that suggestion to the government.
Thank you both. Mr. Gay, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank the witness for being with us today. Actually, I'm going to continue a little bit on the same topic as Mr. Tucker. Let's talk about the, that's for you, Mr. Christidis. Is Can-Do Monarch the next big platform? Because this committee is studying export. We all know about the potential export of uranium, but you were just starting to talk about the potential to export the supply chain of nuclear facilities. Can you expand on, in dollar if you have, and the impact of exporting Canadian technology in the first part? And the second one is Can-Do Monarch, that kind of thing.
Well, let me flip it a little bit the other way just to give you the answer. So the world nuclear market is looking to triple. We're seeing that demand increase. Actually, in Canada itself, as jurisdictions are looking at their own grids here in Canada, and many grids are looking at tripling by 2030, 2050, right? That time frame. Same story internationally. So in international, the world nuclear market is looking to triple. There's a big conversation in terms of what that could look like. There's a role for large nuclear reactors like those that we have in Can-Do, which are based on the refurbishment of OPG Bruce Power in Ontario, which was about $26 billion on time and on budget. That's a really strong success story for Canada. Canada also owns, through Cameco and Brookfield, owns Westinghouse, which is the other large energy technology, and Canada's leading through the small modular reactor initiative. So there's 4 reactors being built by Ontario Power Generation, Hitachi model in Ontario, which are the same 4 in Saskatchewan, which are also linked to the opportunities in countries like Poland and beyond. So across the board, depending which market segment you're looking at a tripling of that type of market, right? And that doesn't even touch on the uranium side as well as the supplier side. So all that to say, very robust potential growth, but it's really predicated on delivering the projects here in Canada. For us, our sector is really based on domestic success that accelerates international success.
Thank you for that explanation. And maybe also for an enlightenment of the committee or people that are not so familiar. You sort of went there talking about large nuclear reactor, small modular reactor. We hear micro reactor. What's the status of each one of those markets in terms of potential to export for us?
So some of the technologies are being deployed, right? So, the CANDU technology, the Westinghouse technology, the Hitachi for the SMR technology, which is about 300 megawatts in size, just to give you a bit of a scope, which is, close to some of the coal plants that they tend to replace. So those technologies are proceeding. So the SMR Hitachi model there's a construction site in Ontario now, OPG, which is building these 4 reactors. Some of the smaller reactors, I'm sorry?
Darlington.
At Darlington, correct. Some of the very, very small reactors are still in that development stage or pilot stage. Some of them are 30 megawatts, 50 megawatts. The concept being some of them could be running mining operations or remote rural areas, pending regulatory approvals, of course. So the concept is there. There's companies that are exploring those technologies, but they're a bit further out in the conceptual stage or the deployment stage.
Another opportunity to export that I've heard in the marketplace, and that's more on the uranium side, our allied in the U.S. and in the U.K. have, and I believe the French, they have a submarine being nuclear propulsion. Have we ever should we consider selling uranium to our allied for their propulsion needs?
Listen, Canada is a country that sticks to non-proliferation agreements, so all it does is based on non-proliferation activities. So the Canadian nuclear industry works under that very strict regime. So Canada does not partake in those type of activities.
Question for Mr. Moon or Mr. O'Connell. You talked a lot about the Asia-Pacific market. Have we considered exporting hydrogen to some of the European countries, some of the provinces in Germany, for example, really want to get ammonia delivered? So have we considered going to Europe, and what would be the path, if there is one, to get there, to the market, to export ammonia to Europe?
Thank you for the question. Yes, we have. I believe it's the Everwind project in the Maritimes, Newfoundland. They're looking at exporting hydrogen/ammonia green. They were going to build a massive wind farm and then build a large hydrogen plant, and I believe a lot of it was going to Germany. We're based in Western Canada, so we only have a cursory knowledge of the market in Europe, and also what kind of activities are being developed in Eastern Canada. We follow it in the media, but we don't have any special insight. Our target is the Asian market because we're Western Canadian based.
Thank you. Monsieur Simard, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madame Durand, for being here. We launched this study in a very specific context because there was trade conflict with the Americans, and then on top of that, there's what happened in Venezuela, and even more recently, what we're seeing with the conflict in Iran and its impacts on the price of energy. certain witnesses came before the committee at the outset, and they said, Normand Mousseau and Pierre Epinot, they said that Canada was not an energy superpower, and therefore we can't have a considerable impact on the cost of energy. And I'd say that the framework of our study is based on seeing how we can develop our energy infrastructure to meet world demand, but also to help with the tariff crisis that we're facing. So I find it very interesting that you've come with something that we are not talking about a lot. That is to say, developing north-south markets with the Americas and opportunities that would come from that. We're doing this study, and currently we have partners that are not as reliable in the South, the Americans, for example, and people who aren't willing to, comply with trade agreements as they did in the past. So you mentioned Mexico, and you talked about demand for clean energy. I'd like to hear you speak about that a little more. Thank you very much, Honorable Deputy Chair. There's a lot to be said. What's quite appealing for Canada is that the countries, like I said, who are reliable, they're reaching out to us so that we can deepen our trade relations within multilateralism that they'd like to renew and that they consider the solution to the current challenges with the United States. So in that sense, Canada is an observer member for the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur as well. But there is an invitation by Brazil. Without excluding bilateral trade agreements, they're really emphasizing the fact that Canada should be part of this trade alliance. And in particular, because in Latin America, what's very valued is green technology, the ability to innovate and propose solutions. In these countries, for example, Mexico is a country that has nationalized its petroleum production, but there are very significant climate changes, and there's a lot of migration that is caused by climate change. So there is awareness in countries like Brazil and Mexico that it's important to turn to countries that have expertise in renewable energies and who have a solid regulatory framework. That's important, and your question has to do with the economic portion of things. There's also a desire to establish a political alliance. When we look at the South, they're looking to Canada as a reliable partner in order to accelerate their trade ambitions. To your knowledge, earlier you said that you were doing a training with Global Affairs Canada. Is there a Canadian strategy to further develop these trade agreements or bilateral connections with countries in Latin America? In fact, yes, there is a very clear strategy with Mexico because we've got the Canada-Mexico plan 2025-2030 and the embassies. In fact, there has never been an alliance implemented in this way with resources granted by each government. And of course, the renewal of the free trade agreement, which includes the U.S., but to really fortify the Canada-Mexico portion, there's something being done on that front. When it comes to Brazil, it's quite interesting because we had an expert who was telling us that, of course, this country is a huge player that's very important for us if we want to increase our activities in the South. Brazil is more interested in multilateral agreements rather than bilateral ones. It's a tradition. They say they're not against, but in fact they prefer that Canada join Mercosur, for example. rather than having bilateral relations directly with Canada. So we'd have to see how that unfolds. But for the moment, that's their official position, and they're inviting Canada very warmly to join it. Is it possible that Canada is timid when it comes to having trade relations with countries in Latin America because it doesn't want to displease our neighbor to the south and therefore jeopardize CUSMA? Yes, most certainly. But strategically, it's important to remember that Mexico is often threatened by the Americans. For example, saying that the leader can't govern its own country. That happened a few days ago. So we have nothing to lose if we further develop our trade relations with these countries who they themselves have been identified as not being good allies of the U.S. Thank you very much.
Mr. Rowe, good to have you back, and you have 5 minutes.
All right, thank you very much. It's not a whole lot of time, but a whole lot of questions. So I apologize if I kind of cut you off on any long answers, but I've got my thinking hat on and trying to learn and trying to educate the public all at the same time. So my first question is for Mr. Christus, and I apologize if I pronounced it wrong, but you mentioned about how the nuclear system is set up in Canada. I believe it's almost like a monopoly, and one of the big partners is Brookfield. Am I piecing this together? If there's any subsidies or any real government help into the nuclear industry, does that theoretically, does that directly impact and benefit Brookfield?
Mr. Chair, I mean, the first point is that no, Canadian energy market in no way is a monopoly. So usually that way it works is each province designs the electricity system that best reflects its own reality. So, for example, in Quebec, you have a very strong hydro experience because of the resources that are there. In Ontario, you have a blended system with renewables, gas, nuclear. That is a hybrid competitive system. And then, well, the nuclear component is the CANDU technology. That is the Canadian technology historically that had been developed by Canadians. That is the supply chain. And as of recently, Canadian companies, including Cameco and Brookfield, purchased Westinghouse. So in the international space, Canadian companies own two of the very important technologies, right? So CANDU itself operates in a number of different countries.
And I think it's good to see Canadian companies, prosper and do good across the country. It's just some voters and some Canadians are just hesitant about what's happening with Brookfield and some subsidies across the country due to the climate. But I am, you talk about global and everything and nuclear. It's interesting. I'm looking at a map that we received in one of the first studies that we did on mining, and there's two big uranium deposits in Canada on this map, one in Saskatchewan and one in Labrador. But I don't believe the Labrador mine is actually operating and actually puts into the system for the uranium for the nuclear energy. How do we get that mine up and running, and how do we get that part of the supply chain and perhaps even part of the global supply chain?
I'm not privy to the Labrador experience per se, but again, each province sort of defines what resources it chooses to develop. So, for example, Nova Scotia has recently reversed original decisions that wanted to limit nuclear and mining in those spaces. And we see a global trend of these reversals. So countries like Sweden, Switzerland, Finland, Norway are all reversing previous hesitations to nuclear in general and are moving down the nuclear energy track. So
it's a big opportunity for us.
each province is going to have to make that determination. All I can speak to is the domestic international trend that points to enormous opportunities. So just in the construction side, there's about $400 billion U.S. in new, build out of nuclear energy, right? And that's just on the construction on the nuclear energy side, let alone the uranium side.
Well, thank you. I've got a question now for Brandon O'Connor or perhaps Brian Moon with Hydrogen Canada Corp. And, I'm kind of wondering, I had a conversation this morning about in the ammonia industry, the fertilizer, and they're very reliant on tax credits and subsidies, and we need perhaps more of them to make some industries work. Does Hydrogen Canada Corporation and hydrogen industry in Canada, do we need more tax credits and subsidies to be competitive on the global market?
I can answer that. Thank you for the question. We would rely heavily on the investment tax credits and also the current carbon trading system, both potentially in either Alberta or BC. So we've kind of worked that into our model, and the investment tax credits definitely support the economics of our facility. And the third piece to it was there's currently a heavy insurance burden on rail traffic for dangerous goods in Canada. So we were part of the conversation between CN and Transport Canada looking for some economic support, not only on the insurance for those rail cars, but also on the freight costs. Transport Canada developed a safety framework that was fairly onerous and increased costs. Ammonia is toxic. So we were looking, so we would have, the tax credits work for us. The carbon levy system works for us. The challenge was the rail transport, and that's eventually what kind of stopped us from moving forward on our facility in Alberta.
Thank you.
And I guess without those, there would be no way to survive without those tax credits. So we need the government to keep doing those to get that industry going.
Thank you, Mr.
Correct.
Rowe. Thank you, Mr. O'Connell. And you can amplify that in a future question, but we're now going to go on to Mr. Danko for 5 minutes. Mr. Danko.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is for Professor Duran. I think she gave some really interesting testimony talking about the breakdown or perhaps the intentional destruction of international law. And she talked about this axis of North American extreme right governments and the Monroe Doctrine as it's interpreted by President Trump. So I just want to give her the opportunity to expand on some of the risks that she mentioned of Canada expanding trade with these far-right extremist governments in terms of our energy exports, especially in the context of agreements that can't be trusted, governments that can't be trusted. Why would we want to do business with those countries?
Thank you so much for the question. Je vais répondre en français.
I'll answer in French, just because I'm used to teaching in French. The risks are considerable. They're connected to the fact that all agencies that currently supervise the contracts and who are answerable to the law, well, those have been abolished. So in El Salvador, for example, there were sanctions for corruption by the Biden government, and of course that changed, especially when Trump arrived and became the key ally. But nonetheless, at this level, when it comes to, well, in fact, the checks and balances in the legal system, all the agencies who are supposed to monitor corruption, they were all abolished in Ecuador and El Salvador and Bolivia. So there is no longer, in fact, when we hear Canadian business people say, well, we're not going to do business in Cuba because we have no legal guarantee that our investments will be protected. Well, the situation is the same or maybe even worse. And the Canadian public can inform this situation, and things move very quickly. In 2 years, legislation has changed. The agencies in charge of verifying contracts and making sure that everything is correct and access to justice is there. Well, we're in a situation that is unprecedented, and for this reason, I think it would be wiser to work with countries who, on the contrary, are putting forward more rigorous regulation, and that's the case in Mexico. They're working very hard to make sure that at all levels, but especially at the level of implementing contracts connected to mining or natural resource extraction, green energy, there's quite a stark contrast. There is a danger, and that's the problem with the free trade agreement with Ecuador, because we have serious concerns and fears. There's supervisory agencies that no longer exist in that country, only 2 years later. sorry if I'm speaking too much, but there's a misunderstanding around judicial checks and balances. They're saying that these agencies are preventing citizens from doing what they wish, and the president, in fact, is taking a populist approach. And this is a problem and a risk for our investments as well.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate your expertise in that area. I'm going to switch topics to hydrogen. That's something that's of real interest in Hamilton with steel industry, with the potential for data centers, green energy. So to the representatives from Hydrogen Canada, you did touch on the importance of Canadian regulation, in particular carbon pricing, to the business model that is enabling hydrogen to expand as an export market. I wanted to give you an opportunity to expand on that, and also further action that we could take on the investment tax credits and also transportation, reducing transportation costs.
Okay, thank you for the question. First of all, a hydrogen facility we produce hydrogen and then convert it to ammonia. So we would produce about 200,000 tons of hydrogen, and of that we would create and then convert that to ammonia. Out of that would come about 1.5 million tons of CO2. So our plan was to capture greater than 96% and sequester it. So we would be capturing and sequestering plus or minus 1.5 million tons, and that would generate offsets in Alberta, and those offsets, would have the revenue generated from those offsets was material to our model. It was in, north of $100 million a year kind of thing. So it was critical to the overall success. We're one of the very few countries, I think the only country in the world that has a carbon levy system where you can recognize those revenues. And anyone looking for blue hydrogen or blue ammonia, would require you to sequester those. So it was material to our business. The only country I can think of is in the U.S., where they have 85Q, which provides $85 per ton of CO2 sequestered, and that was who we were competing with originally.
Thank you.
On the tax credits, we were relying on the hydrogen investment tax credits for the first 2/3 of our plant. We actually worked very hard to get the lowest carbon intensity, but currently the tax credits don't recognize low carbon methane. The NRCan or whoever wrote the legislation decided that they wouldn't accept the differentiated natural gas, which is something that Canada is marketing its gas on right now. Its LNG is the lowest carbon intensity in the world. Yet if we take that low carbon gas and make ammonia, the government doesn't recognize the low carbon intensity. So that's where the tax credits kind of give and take. So we'd like to see modifications to that.
Thank you.
And
I gave you some extra time there, Mr. O'Connell, but and perhaps we can come back to that with a future questioner. Anyway, thank you both. We're on to Monsieur Simard, 2.5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I hope that Mr. O'Connell will allow us to come back to that. So is interpretation working? Can you hear me well? Yes? You can hear me? Excellent. Very quickly then. I understand your response completely. You're saying that you always need that tax credit and carbon pricing. We've had this conversation at the committee a number of times, and unfortunately the Minister of Natural Resources, Mr. Wilkinson, had invited, in fact, while in Berlin there was a conversation with those from Siemens talking about blue hydrogen with carbon capture. What I was surprised to hear is that the people from Siemens said they didn't believe in that model because the technological costs were too high to make it a source of energy that is, appealing. So I wanted to share that with you because it was a surprise to me. So if we add to this, well, you just said that for your facility to work, 2/3 of your financing comes from tax credits. Carbon pricing has to stay in place. And I completely agree with that. And if we add to that what those from Siemens said as risks, the technological costs, which are very high. Do you think that in the short term, realistically, there's a market for blue hydrogen or green hydrogen if we add all those elements together?
Yes, we believe there's a market. There's a mandated market in Korea. The Koreans were ready to sign deals. We were dealing with the two largest power companies in Korea for the last 2.5 years, and they were ready to sign deals as long as we were competitive with any other facility in the world. Our advantage is our cost-effective natural gas. Our gas is cheaper than any gas anywhere on the planet, any major basin, and we're $1 or $2 less than the U.S. Gulf Coast, and we're $5 or $6 less than Australia and the Middle East, any other competing region. So yes, we can be competitive. The technology, if you're producing blue ammonia, you have to capture the CO2 and sequester it, and we can do that very cost-effectively in Canada. It's actually fairly cheap for us because of the way our regulatory environment works. So technologically, it all works. Our big challenge was the fact that, these facilities are designed to be built at Tidewater. We're looking to build it in Alberta, so we had the rail challenge. So what kind of hurt us was the fact that we were inland because that's where our petrochemical industry is based. So, the carbon levy, the technology, none of those were risks as far as we were concerned. The carbon levy was a huge benefit to us, and it makes us competitive with the U.S. in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act. Our challenge was the rail. So to us, it could be a very competitive industry.
Thank you. Thank you both. On to our two final speakers, Mr. Tucker and Mr. Hogan. We're going to give you 4 minutes each.
Thank you, Chair. Back to how we stack up on nuclear and some of our allies around the world. How do we stack up on regulatory timelines compared to the States?
I assume that's to me, Mr. Chair. Yes, if you take a look at the changes that the executive orders have done in the United States, the changes through their national regulator, they're substantially looking at accelerating the number of reduction in terms of the regulatory requirements to proceed. And that's not to say that the U.S. model is the model that we would aspire to. What we're pointing to is this significant trending internationally, the U.S., the U.K., and France. And every country has its own system, right? So I just need to be cautious because each country does have its own system. We have a very strong federal and provincial sort of environment in terms of energy policy overall. But overall, there's definitely a trend line that other jurisdictions are moving to accelerate their regulatory processes to meet their energy needs, climate and security. While in Canada, we're not quite there yet. We're actually going the other way, as I pointed out, in my statement.
Other way, like as layering of regulations?
Well, like I pointed out, last 10 years, there's been an increase about 80% on some of these regulatory requirements to the CNSC, for example.
Did it chill the market a little bit on investment in Canada when the Liberals called nuclear or classified nuclear stock as sin stock, similar to tobacco and other substances?
Well, I'm very happy to tell the you chair and the committee that is no longer the case, and that we have a robust change in the definition of green energy bonds that include nuclear. So it was a very exciting moment in time of the industry that we were able to be included in the definitions. That has helped investment.
I've just toured McMaster University, and a great facility working on radiopharma and some of the breakthroughs. Similar to how you described it, 80% worsening of regulations that the Liberals have enacted in the last 10 years. On radiopharma, there's also a thickening of the regulations and the lack of support for that industry. Can you kind of highlight a little bit on radiopharma and medical isotopes, what they mean to our country and the industry, hopefully?
Well, in terms of nuclear medicine and isotopes particularly, it's a fantastic story. So you may have recently seen an announcement made by Bruce Power and the San Indigenous community, which is about $250 million to develop more isotope capacity. Canada is a leader in that space and actually is catching the attention internationally. So it's one of those export areas that is also seeing a growth in our respective industry, along with small modular reactors and the large reactor discussion as well. So it's quite robust.
And just speaking on the small modular reactors, you talk about the Canadian supply chain. What has the more complete Canadian supply chain, the CANDU reactor or the ones that are being built, the SMRs in Darlington?
The Canadian supply chain right now is CANDU. It's got a CANDU tradition, but that CANDU supply chain is supporting, of course, the activity that is the SMR project in Ontario.
But where would that uranium come from? Where would that be refined that the Liberals are planning on the SMRs?
Well, I can't speak in terms of government, policy per se,
right.
Madam Chair, but Mr. Chair,
but the can be done in Canada.
The uranium is mined in Saskatchewan. They've got a very important facility at Port Hope in terms of the
but
fuel
for the
processing.
SMRs, sir, where would that refined uranium come from?
SMRs require a slightly enriched fuel, and that is partly dependent on the relationship with the United States vis-a-vis of accessing that enriched fuel.
That's
or
a
slightly
problem
enriched fuel with the United States.
for us going forward?
Right now, it's not. Right now, there's enough of cooperation between Canada and the United States in that space, but there's other suppliers as well, including the UK and France, for example. So there's an ecosystem of supply.
Thank you both. Mr. Hogan, you will have the last word for 4 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very much appreciate all of our witnesses today. I really sincerely feel like I've learned a lot, and that is always a good hour spent when we can learn from our experts that come to us today. Mr. O'Connell, I wanted to talk a little bit more about hydrogen, and in particular, when we talk about export opportunities, the integration of federal supports and provincial supports. And obviously our purview is federal, but we want to make sure the right hand and the left hand are working together. And so can you talk a little bit about the overall environment, regulatory, tax credits, grants, all of those things that are available or not, and where the gaps might be in particular between federal and provincial supports?
Thank you for the question. We would have relied very heavily on federal support. Again, the tax credits. We looked at a number of hydrogen plants that were constructed in Alberta, Air Products. They received funding from the Strategic Energy Fund, and we kind of counted on getting similar funding for our project. So federally, we believed we had the support we needed to move forward. The challenge was the rail piece, which was shelved earlier this year, so that's just not getting resolved. Provincially, we would have relied on APIP and some of the programs in Alberta. We wanted to do more work with the government of Alberta on that. The government informed us that they were willing to work on the rail challenge, on some of the costs associated with rail, specifically the indemnity. But the government of Alberta kind of took a backseat, in our opinion, to the federal policy, because we're all waiting for, a decision on the rail support. The government of Alberta kind of backed away. So we would have liked to see more support provincially. We didn't really see it, but, part of it was because they were kind of had a wait and see approach. A second thing that I would mention, and I think it's topical for this panel, is we were looking to do some Aboriginal engagement, because we would have been running this product through BC, through traditional territories. And that was something we were hoping to, we were looking for guidance from the federal government on that, just to kind of lead us through the process. It's something that we don't get that involved in as a project developer in Alberta, per se. We didn't, that was kind of step 4, and we were on step 1, so we never got that far. If that answers your question. So
that's very helpful. Thank you. It's a good reminder that as we think about expanding these opportunities, we're also asking the entrepreneurs and the companies, such as the one you represent, to do things they may not have previously done, and we need to assist through all of that in terms of capacity. Maybe I'll just ask if you want to use the last minute I believe I have here just to say anything that this committee has not addressed that you were hoping to be addressed, anything you'd like to say. You literally get the last word for this one.
Thank you for that, because there is a point I'd like to make. A lot of the conversation that we're having in Canada these days are about exporting raw product. We continue to be a commodity producer. We export natural gas, we export oil, we hopefully export more uranium. We export a lot of agricultural products, but we don't do a lot of value add in Canada. And I think the focus of, the government of Canada and every government in this country is to do value add in Canada. something, both Brian and I are engineers. Brian has his PhD. I have an MBA too, but for us, the value of this is doing value add, doing more technology related projects in Canada, so that we're not exporting just oil or just natural gas. We're actually doing something with it here and selling the world an upgraded product. It creates a more stable economy, and it's a huge benefit to all the technologists and engineers in this country to put them to work. So, we'd like, as much as we like the idea of exporting uranium and oil and gas, obviously, but we really think there needs to be a stronger focus on, doing the value add in Canada.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you for the
so
opportunity to say that.
Thank you. Before I thank the witnesses, Mr. Rowe has raised his hand. Mr.
Yes, point of order, Mr. Chair. I believe it's a point of order. I'm wondering if I can submit some questions to the witnesses for a written response to go into the report.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
And vice versa. We welcome briefs from our witnesses, and just let me, on behalf of the committee, thank you for a really good exchange, early afternoon, good questions, good responses, and good to hear from our hydrogen and nuclear sectors that we haven't, in my view, heard enough from, and thank you for your global perspective, your geopolitical insights, Professor Durant. Colleagues, with that, I am going to gavel us out. The meeting is adjourned.